I never know quite how to start in that kind of description, because part of it has to do with the way of life that I had. Yeah. And the way of life was the kind of family that I was fortunate enough to be a part of in my youth. But if we look at it in terms of the forms and the polyhedral forms that emerged, I had a class in high school with an art instructor that handed me a polyhedral form, or had a series of polyhedral forms in the class, and the assignment basically was take these forms and do something with them. So it was an open kind of idea. And I was not one to do what most people did, and try to do a decorative something to that figure, where you would make the different faces different colors, or draw pictures on it, or punch holes in it, or what have you. And I started out trying to understand more of what was going on in the form itself, and started weaving circles that would reconstruct the form as circular elements rather than planar elements.
That's cool.
And then from that, I started finding that I could penetrate the forms with these circles, and discovered a whole series of them where you could fold them up into some single ring, some single circle. And that was sort of a beginning of thinking about the form in a much different way than what my peers were doing. And I was always one to try to be different, I think, than that. But
me too.
And, all right. Yeah. But then I had a number of people that influenced me, and most all of the different everything. My father was interested in everything. He was a self-taught man. He had got a high school diploma, but beyond high school he didn't. But he had this incredible thirst for understanding and knowing everything. And if I didn't know the answer, or us as children would ask him a question, and he didn't know the answer, instead of saying he would say that, he would admit that, he was very honest about that. But he would say, let's find out together. And so we would explore whatever topic we wanted to do, what the question was. And I had opportunities that he would help make opportunities that later on in my life I thought this was a natural thing. And everybody had those experiences, and later on I found that it was a very unique thing.
Yeah.
He worked in business for a while. He was a manager for a 5 and 10 dime store, S&H Kresge, I think it was called, as a manager type. And then he did welding during the war and learned how to do that for the war effort. And then he became an apprentice chemist in a utility company, and eventually, even though he stayed with that utility company, he went all the way up through the ranks to where he supervised the power plant where he was working. And he had this incredible interest in people and helping other people, and that kind of thing was bred into us, if you will. When we wanted to explore something, he'd talk around and find somebody who had an interest in that kind of thing, and the next thing you know, they sort of became a mentor to us.
Wow, that's so cool.
One of the things is an example of that kind of thing is I grew up in a mineral-rich area of the country, in the tri-state area of the Midwest. And there was a mine in the area, mining, a lot of mining. So I grew up in the mines, and I was always wondering what these crystals were that you'd find in the tailings from the mines. And
how they develop those formations. Right?
Yeah, the beauty of them. They were faceted, the natural growth of some of them were cubes and tetrahedra and the different polyhedral forms. And I would constantly asking my father about these things. I'd ask teachers and not get answers that I thought I should get. And so one time my dad came home and wanted to know if we'd like to take a drive, and we went down into the Eagle Picture mine, about 300 foot underground, with the geologist of that company,
Mm-hmm.
and he explained to us how they grew and showed it those things in that environment.
Yeah.
And so it was that rich environment that I had
Mm-hmm.
growing up with. And eventually I went on, managed to run into Buckminster Fuller, and that's what
Right.
really continued that process. Because Fuller had this unique way, and it was so similar to what my father did, and also
Right.
I think came in through the history of himself, as how he was raised.
Mm-hmm.
Because the father of kindergarten, known as Frobel, it was a forerunner to the present-day kindergarten.
Right.
But he was he came through crystallography as a crystallographer himself.
Mm-hmm.
So he came out of the sciences, yet he
Right.
ended up talking about trying to teach children, not so much teach children, but give them the opportunity
Mm-hmm.
to learn through experimentation and idea,
Mm-hmm.
and guided experimentation.
Right. Which
Right.
is
And
exactly the experience that you had had, right?
that's the same kind of experience. And then later on I found there was a connection between the kindergartens that my father went through and the Frobel teaching method. Because there
Right.
was a Frobel school that my father went through.
Mhm.
And I found that Fuller went through a Frobel school in his early ages.
Mhm.
And one example of that was the story of that Bucky talks about, the dried peas,
Right.
and his introduction to the tetrahedron as being the structure
Mm-hmm.
that became so much of a part of his geometry.
Mm-hmm.
And that was one of the exercises that Frobel had in his teaching kits,
Right.
was
gifts,
giving
right?
children, the gifts,
Mm-hmm.
teaching children or allowing children to experiment with things to make self-discovery
Right.
of certain key principles.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Bucky, you know the story, or most people know the story that he has there, where he
He had severe blindness,
Yeah,
and so he had to
severe.
feel his
And
way through structure,
right.
and he ended up creating these
Creating the
tetrahedron
tetrahedron.
structures, right?
Yeah. So, and that method, or that technique, was
Mhm.
something that I think followed Fuller through his entire life.
Right.
And I'm almost sure that unknowingly my dad had similar kind of ideas that went through him. So
Yeah.
he's just expressing his methods that he picked up in his childhood
Mhm.
that was continued on.
Were your children able to have any experience close to that outside of you, or was
Well,
Did you
through my
see-
father again, because they
Yeah.
had some contact with my parents, even
Mhm.
though we moved away from the Midwest, but they
Mhm.
had it, and some of their experiences were very memorable about that,
Mhm.
those experiences. And then through what I did, and then I think in some ways they lost some of that,
Mhm.
but in other ways I think that they've had a well, I have one daughter who is extremely interested in environmental studies,
Mhm.
and so she was constantly coming back and telling me about. She's very much the same skeptic that I grew up with. So somehow or another, those things came about in
Right.
her training and her teaching. She had a lot of experiences in the schools with experimental approaches, and that was the public school.
Mhm.
And all of my children have had that. They've had through the public school system itself, they ran into teachers here or there that were sort of allowed children to have self-discovery and so on.
Right.
But I noticed over the years that
It was restricted
there's,
in some
becoming
sense?
more and more
Yeah.
strict, and more of the curriculum trying to focus on
Repetition.
well, repetition. I'm not sure that's quite the word for how to express it, but it's more to make everybody alike.
Mhm.
Okay, I'm one that does not at all like the No Child Left Behind idea,
Right.
because that has a tendency to make every school teach the subject exactly the same way, through the same processes and the same method, and not allow for the child to have that opportunity to have self-discovery and self-exploration. And I've seen that get tighter and tighter and tighter over the years. And I taught for 12 years at
Right.
university level, so
Mhm.
and came in contact with teacher educators over time. And it seemed like that they're being choked more and more and more through this process.
Right.
I think we're in the birth of of a whole different way, opportunities for young people that is not coming through the traditional means.
Right.
And an awful lot of that has to do with intercommunication, the internet, that whole process of how we get information and how we sort it out. Although I think there's certain common grounds there. You know, we are constantly concerned about the idea of, or let's say traditionally, we're sort of concerned about the idea of, can you believe the information that you get, is it reliable, that kind of thing.
Right.
But I think the process of doing that for any individual is very similar to the processes that you grew up with before the net was ever there. We had to determine what books are right, what books are wrong, what teachers are correct, what teachers are not.
Right, what's relevant,
what's relevant, what's not relevant,
right.
And we sorted all that out. And I think we're in an era where we're having to revisit that and do that process again.
Right.
But at the same time, I think there's a freedom there to now choose how we're going to combine and how elements combine. We had started to move, and this is one of the things that Fuller was always very concerned about, is that narrow focus.
Right.
You know, we became specialists. We sort of lost that relationship we had back to the environment that we dealt with, you know, thousands of years ago, where we were very intimate with nature.
Right.
And we started to lose that connection.
Also doing multiple things, like you were speaking of your ancestors, being able to build a house, being able to grow the food.
And that's the point. We started to become more and more narrow, more and more focused over time. And so it became a real issue that we have lost that connection. Or that, I don't think you ever lose the connection, it's always there. Right. It's just that we didn't have the triggers to trigger that rediscovery.
Right.
And what we are doing now, I think, with this open networking and open methods and techniques of intercommunications and things, that people are able to explore multiple areas. And I've been very sort of energized by this idea that when I visit the kind of things that's happening on the internet, that young people seem to have multiple interests. They don't have that narrow, single kind of thing that they have been guided to in the past through our traditional educational system. So there's a whole new way of educating people coming out now.
Oh yeah, so there's a way to keep your intellectual interests really alive.
That's
in
right.
Multiple areas. I hadn't thought of that. That's
so the thing that I find is everything has an interaction with everything else. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that. That the activity that we do has a connection to another activity, and that's one of the things I like so much about the work that's being done here, is coming down to look at that in its very, very raw way.
Right.
And it has so many implications to a cross-disciplinary, as we quote, place the word disciplinary.
Right.
You know, we've come to become specialists where we think that there's a difference between biology and chemistry and behavioral sciences, and we've given the spatial name to them to call it that. You know, that the biologist is different than the chemist.
Right.
Okay, but there's those connections, and they're all basically part of that whole, part of that process. And that's one of the things I like about what Tom's doing, and the searches that he's making in these forums that he's working with, is that there's a very fundamental set of conditions that are occurring here that have a connection to and can be used as a model to so many of these other, what we have now become as specialized areas.
Right.
And that's what is always fascinating through this whole process of what are those, what are those common grounds, what are those commonalities, what is that thread that connects this to this? Because we've built languages that are unique to that discipline, and we've sort of lost sight of the idea that they are common.